Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. Today I am here to do a bit of an addendum to my favorite books of the year. I have already done a video on my favorite books. I will link it down below. I also did my least favorite reads of 2019. I will also link that down below. So here are some books that I was considering for favorite and they didn't quite make the list, but I also just really want to talk about them, maybe shout them out a little bit because I think they are good and worth taking note of. Again, just to cover the rules, these do not have to be books that were new in 2019. They just have to have been something that I read within the calendar year. The first one I want to start with is Little Women, because that actually, I started reading this in 2019 and did not finish it until 2020. This was a buddy read with Britta Bowler, and it is an early frontrunner for one of my favorite books of 2020. We'll have to see where it lands on my 2020 list, since it's really a 2020 book. So this is kind of even an addendum to this addendum. And we'll see what happens to it as we get further into the year, but it's a great starting off point. I'll have a lot more to say about this book later this month once I've gotten my finished my 2019 wrap up and talked about my goals. Incidentally, just a fun little fact for you, this copy of the book is one that I had to pick up because the original one that I had only had part 1 of Little Women and not part 2. So I had to go pick up a different one, and I've been carrying it around. And I was at a doctor's appointment, and the person at the counter pointed at it and told me it was a beautiful Bible, because as you can see, it's pocket-sized, it has this elaborate little design on the cover, and it has gilt edges. So I guess just funny little fact for you. It does actually have a dust jacket, but I just think this part is so pretty that I may leave it like this. But anyway, so this is an addendum to this addendum. We'll see what happens to it as 2020 goes on. Now, the first book I want to talk about is one that I got from the library. It's Good Talk by Mira Jacob. It is so good. It's a graphic memoir. It's about a mother trying to have a lot of difficult conversations with her son. I very nearly added it to my favorite books of the year, and for some reason, I stupidly got it in my head that I needed to keep my favorite books to 10. Just do like a top 10 and leave it at that. There's no room for another one. And now, of course, now that I've filmed the video and posted it, I'm thinking, why do I need to do a top 10? This is my channel, my rules. So if I were doing my favorite video now, I would include this. But I didn't, and here we are. So, you know, oh well. Fun fact about this one, Jacqueline from 6 Minutes for Me actually commented on my favorite video to recommend this, and I got to tell her, oh hey, you hit the nail on the head, because I really loved this book. I think it's smart, it's funny, it's a very quick read. It covers a lot of really difficult topics to talk about in America, like race and politics and religion and immigration, and it does all of them in this really smart way. I cannot recommend this enough. It's so good. I'm actually really disappointed that I did not include this in my favorite books of the year. Shame on me for that. And then another book is Unsheltered by Barbara Kingsolver. This one I enjoyed, but I think definitely would not have been part of my favorites. I think I'm comfortable putting it in the addendum, because basically this book has 2 different plot lines, and I don't think they always tie back to each other very well, and I think that's the main thing that keeps me from including this in something of favorites. But I just think it's a very smart book. I responded to parts of it really well. It's very much about the idea of shelter in a lot of different ways. The shelter we get from our parents, the literal shelter we get from our houses, the structures around us, the shelter of religion, the shelter of... It comes at the topic from a lot of different approaches, and all of them are really interesting. It also very much deals with the generational differences in approach and thinking, and the ways in which previous generations have been taught to expect certain things, and maybe the world isn't working out that way, but you still cling to the thinking and the structure, and it's very hard to change. And part of how that is, these 2 different plot lines do get back, is that in the modern world you have 2 parents who have become unmoored. They did everything right that they were supposed to do that they were told they were supposed to do as they were growing up and getting out into the world, and they've ended up essentially homeless. And the older storyline deals with a professor or scientist who is trying to talk about the theory of evolution, and there's a lot of blowback about that, and there's a lot of pushback on that. And it kind of shows that same dynamic of structural change or changes in thinking being very difficult to actually achieve. I think it's a very interesting book. I think it has enough flaws that it can't be called a favorite for me, but I still really enjoyed it. And I hope that makes sense. And I hope you will pick it up as well and appreciate the same things about it that I did. Slight change, my dog Guinness is not letting me do this video without him sitting in my lap, so we'll see how this goes right now. He'll just be here. The next book I want to talk about is Genderqueer by Maia Kobabe. This is a graphic memoir. Maia Kobabe uses the pronouns E-R-M. I screwed that up when I did my review of this book in a previous video, which I will link down below. I will try not to do it again. Maia Kobabe is gender non-binary, and this book is very much about their process of growing up and coming to that self-realization about who he is. And it's very interesting because, you know, as a gay man, I feel like there are parallels in my story and this story. And yet, when it comes to the idea of being gender non-binary or asexual or transgender, there are a lot of things that don't necessarily equate to my experience of the world. So I feel like this book was essential for me to get into that mindset and understand what it is like to grow up as someone in that community. I absolutely recommend it. The illustrations are wonderful, and it reads very quickly. Most graphic memoirs typically do. It's just a very good book. It was a very important read for me. I think it could be a very important read for a lot of other people out there as well. And then we get to Women Talking by Miriam Toews. This was Miriam Toews. This was one of my most anticipated books of 2019. And I really liked it. I again, kind of similar to Barbara Kingsolver, I think there's enough about this one that holds me back from keeping it in my favorites, but I really liked it very much. And I think it's something that would be good for a lot of people to read and experience for themselves. So the premise of this is that a group of women in a Mennonite community have discovered that they were being drugged and raped by men within their community. And in the wake of this very traumatic discovery, there has been a suicide of one of the women, and they meet in secret to try to decide what they are going to do. Are they going to try to, is the Bible telling them that they should forgive and then they could stay as part of this community? Do they want to strike out on their own? Of course, striking out on their own would be incredibly dangerous. It does not tell the location of the women. It is based on an incident that actually happened in, I think, Bolivia, somewhere in South America. So these women are isolated from the rest of the world. They don't understand the rest of the world. They don't even speak the same language as the people around them. So the very idea that they would strike out on their own is, of course, terrifying to them. And there is a lot that goes into this discussion, and it has a lot of really smart thoughts about revenge and faith and forgiveness and the role of women in society. And it's just very good. Part of the reason that I really wanted to make sure I did this addenda video is because I think this is definitely a book that is worth talking about and worth reading. It just didn't crack into my favorites. So I think it's worth calling out and saying this is a really good book. And I'm just noticing it kind of matches the wall around my fireplace. So there you go. One of those weird little things you would only notice in this circumstance right here. The next one is My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite. I really enjoyed this book. I think it does a lot. One of the smartest things that it does is it uses the genre trappings of, say, a mystery thriller to say a lot about sisterhood and a woman's role in society. And I think that's very smart. And it does. I think it can be a little bit overpraised. Like, it made the long list for the Booker Prize. I think it's right that it didn't make the short list, but it's still a really good book, and it's still one that's. I think you can read this book on the thriller level and have a great experience of it, and it's fine. You can also do a real deep dive into the themes, and it gives you a lot to think about and chew on in that respect. So it works on both of those levels. It's also a very short book. I absolutely recommend it. It is worth your time. Following up on that, there was the Stonewall Reader. This is edited by the New York Public Library. There is one specific person who led the editorial. It's Jason Bauman. So he is the head editor, but it is officially edited by the New York Public Library. There is a foreword by Edmund White, who is a famous LGBTQ author. This was a buddy read that I did with Ollie from Book Draw, and that was a great buddy reading experience because we both got to talk about our own coming out and how we fit in within the gay community, which is very much what this book is about. It is determinedly not looking at the history of being gay in America or the Stonewall leading up to, during, and after the Stonewall riots. It's not looking at them in terms of like the white experience of all that, which is kind of what the narrative turned into. It's very much of an inclusive work that looks at what it was like to be a lesbian, what it was like to be transgender, and what it was like to be an LGBTQ person of color during all of these times. And I think that's one of the things that really makes this an essential book. The Stonewall Reader is divided into 3 different sections: a before Stonewall period, a during Stonewall period, and an after Stonewall period. And for each of those, it collects either segments of larger works and writings, or just essays and articles that were written during the time to reflect what life was like for LGBTQ people in those time periods. And of course, in any anthology, there are ups, there are downs, there are good ones, there are bad ones, but it's a very solid collection. The one thing that bothered me, getting back to that, was that the after Stonewall period doesn't merge it into anything larger. It doesn't actually feel like a good reflection of the after Stonewall period. It just feels like more of the same, which is a little bit disappointing. And I feel like part of that struggle is that this book is very determined to really only focus on Stonewall, but you can't really talk about the history of LGBTQ people in America after Stonewall without getting into other things like gay marriage or AIDS and how people reacted to those within society. And it's very determined not to engage in those. And I understand why, but it also feels like it's left without a narrative at the end. So I'd say this is an essential book, but that last part is a little flawed. Then there is The Nichol Boys by Colson Whitehead. I really enjoyed this book. I listened to it on audio. It's a very good book. It kind of cements Colson Whitehead's status as an author. I have a longer review of it that I will link down below. It's a very interesting, so it tells the true story of a reformatory school in Florida that would take in these troubled boys, and especially boys of color could be punished or even killed very severely for being there. And through that, it gets at a lot of the idea of race in this country and how it wasn't solved by the Civil War. It wasn't solved by the Civil Rights Movement, which is happening in the sort of present of the story as it is being told. And it gets at a lot of the really complicated aspects of race in this country that we don't generally talk about. And I think it's a very good book, worth your time. I would absolutely recommend it. And then we have My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, which I have a copy of, but I actually listened to on audio. The audio production was very good, by the way. So this is the first part in the Neapolitan series. It is about 2 friends who grow up in Italy in the 1950s. They come of age in the 1960s as teenagers, and it's about their life, and it's about the progression of politics and society in Italy at the time. One of the things that's really interesting about this is each of these kids growing up, being born in the 1950s, their parents were obviously alive during World War II, and they kind of discover things about what their parents did during World War II and try to reckon with them. Because of course, you know, Mussolini was in power in Italy heading into World War II, and there's also a very distinct push and pull between the traditional Italy and the modern Italy that is coming. And I think it's a really fascinating study of that, and I can't wait to read the rest of the books in the series to see how the rest of them go. For instance, one of the things that's interesting, my mother's family is from Italy, and one of the things that's interesting is in this book, as these 2 girls become educated, they learn proper Italian, not dialect, and it becomes a sort of social tool where you can tell who's educated, who's rich, and who is like basically redneck, just trash, based on whether or not they can speak Italian or if they just speak dialect. And I think that's really interesting. My mother's family came here before the people started really moving away from dialect, so they still to this day speak dialect, not regular Italian. And it also really, there's not a whole lot of plot in this book per se. It's much more about the lives of these 2 girls. And it's fascinating. It never felt slow to me. It never really felt like it was dragging, maybe in 1 or 2 parts actually, but it just felt so interesting, and I can't wait to read the rest of the books in the series. There is also Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi. I listened to this on audio. It's really short on audio. Basically, this is a great primer for people like me on what it is to be Black in America and to grow up and be taught, quote unquote, your place in America, and what it is to fight against what the role that you feel you have been assigned in this country. And it's fascinating, really well written. I know Ta-Nehisi has another book, nonfiction book, that I really want to read, and he released a novel, The Water Dancer, last year that I'm very much looking forward to reading in 2020. Can't wait to get around to that. I recommend the audio because one, it's short and easy to listen to, but also it is narrated by Ta-Nehisi himself, and it's nice to hear all of these thoughts from him. And that's it. Those are all of the also rans, the kind of addenda to my favorite list. I would love to hear if you've read any of them, if you like any of them. Maybe you disagree with me, you thought some of the flaws were a little harsher than I thought they were. So yeah, absolutely let me know. I'm not going to do anything like this for the worst books that I read. I think I've covered that pretty extensively. That wraps up the favorites and the least favorites of 2019. Next, I'm going to be talking about my goals for 2019 and for 2020, wrap up on 2020, and new goals, wrap up on that 2019, new goals for 2020. And I look forward to sharing those with you. I have not started on any of them. I've actually had a very slow reading month in January so far. And I'm looking forward to getting some of my reading actually going. Now we're 8 days in and I've only read one book. Well, I finished one book in January and it's something I started in 2019. I haven't even started another book yet. So I'm looking forward to diving in to actual 2020 reading as well. I will get back to that. And as always, one thing I did want to say, I saw a video from Jason over at Old Blues Chapter and Verse. He talked about this tragic loss of a friend of his who was a commenter in the community. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think it's easy when you talk about the booktube community to think of the creators because the content is literally what you see on here. But I think it's important to note that there wouldn't be a community without the people who comment on the content. And there are a lot of people who comment regularly on my videos. And after I heard what he said, and I will link his video down below where he talked about that, I always say I appreciate your time and I appreciate you following along. And I just kind of want to hammer in, I really do appreciate that because that's the entire reason I do this. And I always thank you for your time, but I want to put a special bow on it this time and say, no, I really, really do appreciate it. And I appreciate anybody who not only takes the time to watch the video, but then takes the additional time to leave a comment or a thought. It's why we're here. So thank you for that. And anyway, I'm off my soapbox now. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.